The year was 1993, and the small, sun-drenched town of Vista Ridge, nestled on the edge of the sprawling Mojave, was a place where nothing ever happened. Life moved at the pace of the desert breeze, and the loudest noise was often the midday whistle from the local gypsum plant. At the heart of it all was the Vista Ridge Savings and Loan, a squat brick building managed by the meticulous, somewhat timid Mr. Silas Thorne. Silas, a man whose life was dictated by ledgers and lunch breaks, was accustomed to the predictable rhythm of his small branch. His teller, a bright-eyed young woman named Clara Jensen, was studying accounting at night, dreaming of escaping the town's stifling quiet. On the morning of October 14th, 1993, the air inside the bank was thick with the faint smell of old paper and freshly brewed coffee, the scent of security and routine. Outside, a dusty, beat-up 1978 Ford F-250 pickup sat idling across the street, its engine rumbling just enough to mask the nervousness of its two occupants. Inside the truck were Mark Bell and Victor Vic Reyes, two transient men who had spent the last 2 years planning this single, desperate act. Mark, the older of the two, was the calculated mind. Vic, the former construction worker, was the volatile muscle. Their motivation was simple: a debt they could never repay, a life they had to flee. 10:27 morgens. The doors of Vista Ridge Savings and Loan hissed open. Mark and Vic moved with a chilling, practiced efficiency, their faces obscured by ski masks despite the oppressive heat. Their gear was minimal: 2 aging, heavy-duty duffel bags and a sawed-off shotgun carried by Vic, which he never had to fire. The sound of the shotgun rack against the marble floor echoed terrifyingly in the small space. Everybody on the floor. Now, nobody moves, nobody gets hurt, Vic barked, his voice raw and strained. Clara dropped her pen. Silas froze, his hand hovering over the silent panic button under the counter, a button he knew that connected to the understaffed local sheriff's office 5 blocks away. Mark vaulted the main counter, moving straight for the main vault. He didn't ask for cash from the drawers. He had a floor plan, a meticulous understanding of the bank's weak points. He knew the internal timing mechanism. Thorne, the vault. "Don't be a hero," he hissed, the cold metal of his own handgun pressing against the manager's temple. Silas, pale and shaking, complied, keying in the combination. The total haul, snatched primarily from the seldom-used night deposit boxes and the General Reserve cage, was precisely $4/$1, $5.30 to $20. It took them 7 minutes and 32 seconds. 10:35 morgens. The two men ran out the back door and straight into the waiting Ford F-250. The duffel bags, heavy with cash and bank bands, were unceremoniously thrown into a custom-built, hidden compartment under the extended floor of the truck bed, covered by a greasy tarp and spare tires. The truck's age was its advantage. It was nondescript, a ghost on the road. They didn't head for the freeway. Their route was a pre-planned path straight into the unforgiving, empty landscape of the Calico Basin. For miles, the truck bounced along fire service roads and forgotten mining tracks, kicking up huge plumes of ochre dust. Mark drove, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the jagged mountains met the searing blue sky. Vic sat shotgun, constantly checking the rearview mirror for the telltale, flashing lights. The local police response was slow. Sheriff Ray Mitchell, an old-school lawman approaching retirement, arrived 5 minutes after the robbers had already disappeared, finding Silas and Clara huddled behind the counter, clutching each other. Archive. Witness statement: Clara Jensen. The sound of the truck was so loud, but then nothing. The silence after was the worst. It felt like they just dissolved. No screech of tires, just the engine fading into the wind. Protocol, page 4. Sheriff Mitchell knew they weren't going to be found on the main road. The desert was a graveyard for secrets. The official investigation, dubbed Operation Desert Gold, was quick to conclude that the robbers had escaped across state lines, likely heading towards the coastal cities to disappear into the masses. The evidence was scarce: blurry security camera footage showing 2 masked men, and the vague descriptions from Silas and Clara of a heavy-set and a lanky man. The Ford F 250 was never spotted leaving the region. The community reaction was one of shock, followed by frustration. How could two men vanish with so much money from their tiny town? Rumors swirled. There was an inside job, that the mafia had done it, that the cash was buried in an old mine shaft. Meanwhile, 120 miles away from Vista Ridge, in a desolate rocky stretch of the Calico Badlands known only to prospectors and coyotes, the Ford F-250 was brought to a violent, fiery halt. Mark and Vic, convinced they were safe, had driven over a nearly invisible tripwire, a poorly placed, improvised landmine left over from a decades-old, forgotten military exercise. The explosion was deafening, tearing through the front axle and igniting the fuel tank. The resulting blast scattered debris and scorched the red earth. In a miracle of poor engineering and sheer luck, the custom-built metal compartment under the truck bed was shielded by the frame and the thick layers of cash within the duffel bags. Mark and Vic, though severely burned and dazed, managed to crawl out of the burning wreckage, dragging the two duffel bags with them. They were alive, injured, and stranded, but the money, incredibly, was mostly intact. They abandoned the charred, smoking hulk of the Ford, staggering off the track and deeper into the unforgiving, rocky terrain, carrying their blood-soaked fortune. They needed a place to hide, and the desert offered a terrifying sanctuary. Sheriff Mitchell's team found the wreckage 3 days later, after a passing aerial patrol spotted the column of smoke in a remote, restricted zone. The blast radius and the severe scorching of the vehicle led the state police experts to a hasty conclusion. The robbers had been transporting explosive material, perhaps to open another safe, which had detonated accidentally, killing them instantly and vaporizing the cash. The compartment was missed in the initial chaotic wreckage sweep. Archive, official incident report, lead investigator, state police. Vehicle destruction is consistent with high-yield internal combustion event. No identifiable human remains were recovered. Presumption of death for the two perpetrators is maintained. Case closed due to death of suspects and complete destruction of material evidence, cash. Protocol, Exhibit B, page 12. The public accepted the official narrative of fiery justice. The money was gone. The culprits were dead. Closure, of a sort, descended upon Vista Ridge. 12 years later, in 2005, the file of Operation Desert Gold sat thick with dust in the cold case archives of the new Vista Ridge Police Department. Sheriff Mitchell had retired, and the case was assigned to Detective Elena Rodriguez, a young, methodical investigator with a keen eye for details the old guard missed. She was sifting through the evidence, not out of any real hope, but as a mandatory part of a departmental cold case review. She found a small, almost insignificant detail in the initial property recovery manifest, an oversight that should have been trivial but gnawed at her intuition. Listed as unclaimed personal effects, recovered near vehicle was a single item, a standard, sealed roll of 35mm film, found lodged between two rocks 50 yards from the main blast site. The film was damaged but not destroyed. The original report noted it as useless, unexposed civilian film, likely dropped by previous hikers. It had never been developed. Elena, driven by an almost irrational curiosity, sent the film to the new state-of-the-art forensic lab, requesting a delicate chemical recovery. She didn't expect anything. The film was old, heat-damaged, and might not yield an image. 3 weeks later, the lab returned a single, grainy, and partially developed photograph. It was not a picture of the desert. It was a close-up black-and-white image of two men, unmasked, smiling awkwardly, standing in front of a slightly out-of-focus background, the familiar facade of the Vista Ridge Savings and Loan. The film had been a final, reckless souvenir taken just hours before the heist. One man was Mark Bell, the other Vic Reyes. But that was not the twist. The final, chilling detail that jumped out at Elena was a fleeting shadow in the lower right-hand corner of the frame, reflected in the polished brass plaque on the bank door. It was the clear reflection of a third person taking the photograph. This person was not Vic. This person was not Mark. And this person was wearing a crisp, familiar uniform, the light gray and blue of the local Vista Ridge Patrol. The official story was a lie. The men did not die alone. They had an accomplice, an insider who not only helped them case the bank, but who was there in the final hours. Who was this third man? And if the police were involved, what other truths were buried under the Mojave sand? If you want to know what Detective Rodriguez discovered when she pulled the thread on this small-town lie, subscribe and comment with the city you're watching from. The grainy photograph, a silent testimony from a decade past, landed on Detective Elena Rodriguez's desk with the weight of an accusation. The reflection, though distorted, was unmistakable. A younger man, mid-20s, with a prominent jaw and the distinctive stitching of a Vista Ridge Patrol uniform visible on the sleeve. This was not a random hiker. This was an inside job that the state police had swiftly and conveniently buried. Elena immediately pulled the personnel files for 1993. The pool of officers was small. She cross-referenced the image's reflection details with photos from the era. The jawline, the height, the shift schedule for the morning of October 14th. The trail led quickly to one name, Officer Danny Hayes. Hayes was a young, ambitious patrolman in 93, known for his recklessness and heavy gambling debts, a detail conveniently omitted from the initial official reports. He had since risen through the ranks, transferred to the county sheriff's office, and was now a respected lieutenant in the bordering community of Silver Bend. Elena brought the photograph to her superior, Captain Miller, a man who valued departmental harmony over reopening old wounds. He stared at the reflection, then at Elena. Rodriguez, this is circumstantial. Hayes is a lieutenant now. This file is closed. You are chasing ghosts in old thermal paper. But Elena couldn't let it go. Sir, the official story states the money and the men vaporized. If Hayes was involved, the money never did. The whole conclusion was based on a faulty initial sweep that missed the perpetrators walking away with the cash. She secured a low-profile warrant to access Hayes's financial records from 1993 to 1994. The records revealed a massive, sudden repayment of high-interest loans in late 1993, followed by a seemingly legitimate mortgage on a small, isolated ranch property near the very edge of the Calico Badlands, miles from the blast site, yet eerily close to the general direction of the escape. This wasn't proof, but it was a solid foundation for suspicion. Elena knew she needed to break the silence of the key witnesses. She started with Clara Jensen, the former teller, who now worked in bookkeeping 50 miles away, still struggling with the trauma of that day. Clara met Elena in a quiet diner. She was visibly nervous, clutching her coffee cup. The passing years had not dulled the fear in her eyes. Clara, I need you to think back to the minutes before the men entered the bank. Did you notice anything out of the ordinary? Elena asked softly, leaning in. Clara shook her head, repeating the same details she'd given 1,000 times. Just the quiet, and that old truck across the street. It was running a long time, maybe 10 minutes. Did you see anyone talking to the men in the truck? Maybe a local resident or a police officer? Clara's hand trembled, spilling a drop of coffee. Her eyes darted away. This was the moment of truth. There was a patrol car, a VRPD cruiser. I remember because it was unusual for them to park there. They usually park by the cafe, Clara whispered. I saw Officer Hayes get out. He walked toward the truck, leaned in for maybe a minute, and then he drove off fast the opposite way. I thought he was checking on a possible issue. He left just before the robbery. Transcript, diner interview, Clara Jensen, 2005. Clara, he just tapped the window, and then Mark and Vic nodded. It wasn't a stop. It was a coordination. He looked straight at the bank then. When he left, I felt relief. 10 minutes later, they came in. I never told Mitchell this. I was afraid, Detective. He was the police. Elena, you did the right thing telling me now, Clara. This confirmed Elena's worst fears. Hayes hadn't just helped them. He had cleared the way, ensuring the coast was clear for the getaway, and then immediately drove away from the anticipated crime scene to establish an alibi. The next critical step was to revisit the blast site. The location, officially deemed a military contamination zone to keep away curiosity seekers, had barely been touched in 12 years. Elena secured a new team, focusing on forensic archaeology rather than a simple sweep. The objective: find the remaining evidence that the state police had ignored. The hidden compartment: any trace of the men walking away. In a scene stripped bare by sun and wind, the scorched frame of the Ford F-250 was still visible, a rusty monument to the tragedy. The new team used ground-penetrating radar. They found signs of significant heat distortion, but also, several feet away, they detected an anomaly: a large area of compacted, disturbed earth. Digging carefully, they found it. Not the cache, but the metal shell of the custom-built hiding place, torn free from the truck bed by the force of the blast. Inside, there were still tiny fragments of the nylon duffel bags and chillingly large, dark stains that tested positive for human blood. The official report said the men were vaporized. The blood proved they had crawled away, severely injured, but alive. More importantly, lodged deep within the metal shell, Elena found a small, crinkled object, a receipt from a gas station in a remote town called Borrego Springs, dated October 15th, 1993, the day after the robbery. This placed the men 150 miles southwest of the explosion site, not dead, but clearly moving, seeking medical aid or safer haven. They had been injured, they had survived the blast, and they had bought fuel for a new getaway vehicle. This was the proof needed to move on Lieutenant Hayes. The men did not die. The money was not destroyed. A patrolman helped them escape armed with the photo, the receipt, and Claire's transcript. Elena initiated a formal investigation into Lieutenant Hayes, pulling him in for an informal, non-custodial interview under the guise of an old case review. Hayes walked into the interrogation room with the practiced confidence of a senior officer, his demeanor cool, almost arrogant. He laughed off the idea of his involvement. "Detective Rodriguez, I was barely out of the academy. I barely knew those two transients. I stopped that day because the truck looked suspicious. I filed a traffic stop report, which I assume is in that dusty file." "It is, Lieutenant," Elena replied, pushing the gas station receipt across the table. "Borrego Springs, dated the next day. This was found at the blast site. Why would men who supposedly vaporized need to buy gas the next morning, 150 miles away?" Hayes's composure cracked for a split second, a flicker of fear in his eyes. But he quickly regained control. "A coincidence. The desert is full of abandoned trash. It's a non-issue." Elena then produced the photograph, placing it in front of him. Hayes stared at the reflection of his younger self in uniform. He remained silent for a long, tense minute. "We know you set up the getaway, Lieutenant. We know you established the alibi. But the money is the key. Where did they go with the $1.5 million?" Elena pressed. Hayes finally leaned forward, his voice a low, gravelly monotone, masking his panic with calculated calm. "They were stupid, Detective. They got greedy. They weren't supposed to take that rural route. The money, I heard a rumor years ago. They were ambushed later far out. They probably died out there, miles from the truck. You have your closure. Don't ruin my career over a ghost story." This was the crucial lie. Hayes was covering his trail. Elena played her final card, a transcript from a recently recovered and enhanced audio recording of a dispatch log for 1994, recovered from a decommissioned radio tower archive. Transcript: enhanced dispatch log. March 1994, static unknown male, low, disguised, need to confirm the acreage, near the old copper pit. Bell and Reyes, no sign. The transfer is done. Confirm the property title is clean. Pause, brief heavy breathing. Hayes, VRPD officer, clear confirmed. Title clean. The pit is secured. Lay low. Click. The dispatch log proved two things. Hayes was in communication with someone about the disposal of the money and the securing of a specific property months after the supposed deaths. The voice of the responding officer was undeniably Hayes's younger voice. Hayes's face went white. He knew the log was irrefutable. "I was just a bagman, Rodriguez. They promised me $$50, $000 to clear the road and keep the cops slow. I didn't want the blood on my hands, so I gave them a hot tip on a place to hide for a few weeks, that old property. They were supposed to leave the country. I never saw them again after 1993. This was a partial confession, but Elena was certain he knew more. The land he bought in 1994, the isolated ranch, was exactly where he'd told the mysterious pit was secured. The old copper pit. Elena secured a search warrant for Lieutenant Hayes's isolated ranch property, citing the new evidence and the audio log. The ranch was large, desolate, and unremarkable. The property listing mentioned an old, disused irrigation well and a capped copper pit. The copper pit, covered by a rusty corrugated iron sheet, was their target. The scent of dry earth and decay was overwhelming as the team lifted the metal cover. The pit was deep, but not a well. It was a narrow, deep vertical shaft covered with debris and a decade of desert dust. Using a geological core drill, they found disturbed foreign material about 30 feet down. The recovery was long and grim. What they pulled out 1 decade later was not the $1.5 million, but two distinct sets of human skeletal remains. The clothes were tattered and sun-bleached, but a dental record confirmed the identity. Mark Bell and Victor Reyes. They hadn't died in the explosion. They hadn't escaped to Borrego Springs for a new getaway vehicle. They were severely injured, yes, but they had made it to the designated hiding spot, Hayes's new property. Hayes had then betrayed them. The final twist of the knife. The medical examiner's report on the remains indicated not blast trauma, but blunt force trauma to the skull and neck. They had been killed after they arrived at the pit, likely struggling and weakened by their burns, betrayed by the man they trusted to give them sanctuary. Lieutenant Daniel Hayes was arrested that night, not for facilitating a robbery, but for the double homicide of Mark Bell and Victor Reyes. In the ensuing trial, the full, sordid truth emerged. Hayes confessed that when Bell and Reyes stumbled onto the property in late October 1993, burned and delirious, they were a liability. They had the money, but they were in no state to flee. Hayes went to the property, found the duffel bags of cash, and realized he could take it all. He didn't want the $$50,000 cut. He wanted the whole $$1.5 million. He waited until they were asleep or nearly comatose and killed them, dumping their bodies down the unused mine shaft. The money itself was never fully recovered in cash. The funds have been systematically laundered over the next 12 years, cleverly intertwined with Hayes's legitimate real estate investments, including the very ranch where the men met their end. The moral closure for the victims' families, who had always been told Mark and Vic were simply killed by the bomb, was the painful knowledge that their loved ones were not instantly vaporized, but brutally murdered for greed. For Vista Ridge, the revelation that a local patrolman had orchestrated a major heist and hidden the bodies on his own land shattered the town's fragile sense of safety and trust. Elena Rodriguez, through her tireless, meticulous pursuit of the hidden reflection in a grainy photo, proved that the official archive is only as truthful as the people who write it. The tragedy of Vista Ridge was not the theft of the money, but the betrayal of the badge, the corruption hidden in plain sight, and the unforgiving silence of the Mojave Desert, which kept the true crime secret for over a decade. Detective Elena Rodriguez was promoted and received a commendation for her work. Her reputation cemented as the cold case specialist who cracked the impossible. She later helped establish a new, independent civilian oversight board in Vista Ridge, ensuring that official reports and archived evidence would be subjected to far greater scrutiny. The families of Mark Bell and Victor Reyes, though receiving no financial restitution, found a sense of peace in knowing the true fate of their sons and the real face of their killer. The desert had finally given up its gold and its ghosts.